Why was the Northeast ignored for so long?
It was the multiple governments, they felt that they haven't done anything for their people. It would also be you and me that they would not like.
Why?
कि अरे तुम तो इंडिया से आते हो.
Were these policies of the British also kind of separating the Northeast from the rest of the country?
Yes, they brought in religion as well. So Nagaland missionaries could go in, but sadhus couldn't.
What is Nagaland like?
Stunning, very good-looking people. The Northeasterners are by far one of the most good-looking bunch of people I've seen.
From all my friends who've actually explored the Northeast, that is probably the most beautiful part of India.
Everybody should go to the Hornbill Festival as an initiation to what Naga culture is. They have Ras Leela.
What's the average person's life like in the northeastern states?
Any state that you went to, there was conflict, there were multiple insurgent groups, there was extortion.
Local police in Manipur started fighting with the Indian army and they fired bullets at each other.
Photographs of their dead bodies were released. The first thing that told me is somebody doesn't want.
This conflict to calm down.
Yeah.
They like to keep this running in order to make more money.
Yes, conflict always makes money.
The cookie girl who was paraded.
Using women and children as political fodder, it should never happen with a woman. That's not how you get what you want. I think that's a very cowardly thing to do.
And I hate saying this to everyone watching this from the Northeast, but the rest of India doesn't know much about you because the media has not spoken about you guys enough.
The fact is that nobody wanted to have a focus on the Northeast. Everybody was too focused on Jammu and Kashmir, and it's shocking.
I've personally always felt that the northeast of our beautiful country does not get the kind of media coverage it deserves, especially considering everything that's happening in Manipur. I personally feel that it's the job of old world media to be covering these topics in much more detail, but that doesn't happen. And therefore, new media, which is the world of podcasts and YouTube, will have to bring the truth to the forefront. This is an attempt to bring the truth about Manipur and the truth about the northeast of our country out to the public. Rami Niranjan Desai is an anthropologist and a researcher who's authored books on the northeast. She spent time in the northeast. She spent a lot of time in Manipur as well. This is her first-hand account of everything that's going on in Manipur as we speak. This is her first-hand account of the northeast in general. I hope to cover topics related to the northeast of India much more on this podcast, but we're beginning with this episode featuring Rami Niranjan Desai on TRS. Rami Desai, welcome to this Northeast special of TRS.
Thank you so much for having me, Ranveer. And I'm absolutely thrilled that you are interested in the Northeast.
Yeah, I think there is an entire generation of Indians that's always been interested in the Northeast, but traditional news media hasn't shown us enough. I won't say traditional news media, generally traditional media has not really educated us enough about the Northeast. So even in today's conversation, I'm going to take on a bit of a student personality and sit in front of you. Maybe my first question to you is something that some audience members may think. It might sound like a rude question, but trust me, it's not. The question is, how do you know so much about the Northeast and why should people be listening to you when it comes to the Northeast?
I think I'm somebody who has a great passion for the Northeast to the extent that even in my teenage years, I knew I wanted to go there. So when I went to England to study, I studied subjects that would allow me to study the Northeast, whether it was theology or anthropology of religion, so on and so forth. And the years that I went into the Northeastern year were years when insurgency was fairly peaking. Any state that you went to, there was conflict, there were multiple insurgent groups, they were active, there was extortion, there was almost extortion had become institutionalized to such an extent that it was called tax collection.
Damn. Which time period is this?
So I started going there in 2008, and then I kept following it up. It's been my entire life study to, become more aware about the Northeast.
You said that in that period, there was extortion going on throughout the whole region. So all 8 states were going through some kind of insurgency together.
I wouldn't say 8 because Sikkim has always been peaceful, but the 7 states had their problems. Assam, as you would recall, had Ulfa, and then Ulfa broke down. Then there was Dulfa, and there was duplicate Ulfa, and then there was Sulfa. Because as all insurgent groups, all militant groups, they tend to at some point have different aspirations and they splinter out, which makes things a lot more complicated because one group then has like 6, 7 other groups. Who are you negotiating with? There was NSC and IM. Well, NSCN before it split into IM and K. K was functioning out of Myanmar and controlling, large parts of the region. The idea of the group, and this is an example I'm giving you because you'll be surprised, that was the longest running secessionist movement in this country, and not many people had heard about it. They wanted they wanted all of Nagaland, parts of Assam, parts of Arunachal, and parts of Manipur. So, like the strip between India, from India and Myanmar. So, which also would put us in serious strategic jeopardy. Our national security would be compromised. But this is what they wanted, and their name for the country that they had chosen was Nagalim, which constituted of these areas. So, there were many groups like this. Manipur had so many groups that you couldn't even remember. What were the names? There were new ones would die, become, other new ones would come up. So this was fairly throughout. And obviously, as you know, that any sort of insurgent group, any sort of militia would require money to sustain it, to sustain its cadres. It comes from extortion, local extortion. It comes from drug smuggling. It comes from weapons being smuggled, so on and so forth. But what happened with a lot of these groups, they started with a populist base. They said, oh, we are representative of, local people. So initially, local people supported them, thinking, they're going to represent our aspirations. But beyond that, it changed into just what I would consider as simply extortionist group. Let me tell you, there were so many groups by the end of it that a shopkeeper couldn't run his business because he had to give money to not one group, but multiple groups. So a youth organization came up, and I met with them in Nagaland. And that organization wasn't against extortion. They called it illegal taxation. But they said, you want to tax us, that's fine. But can you just put it together and like a GST,
Damn.
a consolidated tax. And to me, coming from Delhi, if you'd have gone there from Bombay, like these things are something that we see in movies or we read in books maybe. You don't think it's happening in your country.
Okay, you've given me a lot of tangents. Firstly, simple question to begin with. In 2024, outside of Manipur, in the rest of the region, is there still a big insurgency problem?
Post-independence, insurgency just kept getting worse and worse and worse. We kept alienating our people. And I'm sure we'll come to that, as to question why. Because like I said, there's a psychological distance and there's a geographical distance. One obviously needs to understand why there is this distance. Most people in India, if you were to go on the road and ask them, tell us the 7 states in the region, they possibly would not be able to name them. So this is a psychological distance that we have created, and there are reasons for that.
Who do these insurgents view as their enemies? I'm assuming it's the government.
See, of course, they wouldn't be secessionist if they, had some idea of integration. So, of course, it was the multiple governments. They felt that they haven't done anything for their people. We've been left back, it's backward. It's because of you guys. You've ignored us. Racially, you make a difference between us. We want to assert our own identity. There were all these gamut of problems. Having said that, with a small section of people, it would also be you and me that they would not like.
Why?
Because again, it's this alienation, कि अरे तुम तो, they used to say तुम तो India से आते हो. And this is not, again, I'm making it very clear, this is not representative of everybody, right? This is a small section of people with a separatist mindset who are like, you've got everything. You guys are the power center.
I mean, do you really blame them for even thinking like that, considering the fact that they were ignored for so long?
I've never blamed them. I think it's our fault. Yes, on the other hand, I'll tell you that some of their leadership has constantly endeavored to sow the seed of,
Separatism.
they've tried to always say that, nahi, dekho, they're not doing enough for us. Oh, look, they ignore us. So therefore, they've made it difficult for people to have closer connections.
Okay. The one thing I'm picking up from this whole conversation is the Northeast is extremely complex. And we're constantly on these generalized tangents about insurgents, separatism. It's a generalized question to you again. But most of these insurgent groups, they are all kind of fighting for this one cause of having their own territory, right? That's the sense I get, because they feel ignored generally by the Indian population as well as the Indian administration. So they think that if they have their own territory where they have the power to rule, they'll probably do a better job in terms of giving the people in their territory a better life.
Yeah.
That's what I'm picking up from this whole conversation.
Yeah. That's what they feel. And they feel that their interests can be represented as other people also would feel, by people who understand them, people from within their communities.
Sure. What's the average person's life like in the northeastern states? And I know this is a hyper generalized question, but that's exactly what I'm going for. Because what has it led to in the modern day now? All this lack of policy making, etc., etc.
See, yes, it's a generalized question. I'll give a generalized answer to this. Like you said, you met somebody on the flight and they said, oh, we feel ignored, we feel isolated. I'll give you a personal example. When I went there, it was like, oh, you'll never understand us. You can't study us. You can't be representative of, our history or our anthropology. And I found that very strange, because if I wanted to go and study Maharashtra, or if a Maharashtrian wanted to come and study Delhi, it wouldn't strike anybody. There have been scholarship from all around India on Jammu Kashmir, Pakistan. There's never been a question like that. But there is this tendency to isolate yourself also, and that comes from this, these policies of exclusion and isolation. Yes, they were ignored. Yes, there was no infrastructure. That's one of the reasons, as you would appreciate, there's so many people who come from there, young kids who study in Bangalore, who study in Bombay, who study in Delhi. Why should they need to come here?
I would assume that most of the youth leaves the Northeast for economic opportunities.
Absolutely.
In the
When I
metros.
first went to Manipur, one of the things that struck me was I wouldn't see a lot of kids who were over the age of like school going, like college kids. And then until the age of about 35, 40 or so, you wouldn't see a lot of people of that generation, because there was nothing like curfew. You'd have a curfew for hours in a day. There was nothing to do in the evenings because, again, it was not safe. There were power shortages. There wasn't great infrastructure. What are kids going to do? Plus their parents didn't want them to be there because there was essentially a security threat.
The way I understand this whole youth migration thing is, if a city or a town has enough career opportunities, people stay back. And I see that a lot in Chandigarh. It used to be a place where people used to move out from.
Yeah.
But corporates have come up, startups have come up. You see the same in Goa as well. You see the same in Kerala.
Yeah.
My actual question is that happening in the Northeast? Like, are big companies, MNCs, even thinking of setting up offices in Tripura, Guwahati? What's the ground reality?
Yeah, of course. Now, like we discussed earlier, as insurgencies come down, industry is coming in, but more importantly, really, Ranbir, people are wanting to start businesses, entrepreneurship, with whatever's available, local material. You'll see great furniture coming out of there. You'll see great food coming out of there. We have huge amount of, I don't know about Bombay, but Delhi, we have huge amount of Northeastern restaurants. So people are not just setting up, we have branches of restaurants that were there and now they're coming to Delhi,
As in, they're taking the local culture and figuring how to turn that into businesses.
Absolutely. And that can only happen really if where you've started it from is successful enough, wherein you want to branch it out.
Gotcha.
The less alienation happens and more money locally you make and less people have to get out of their states.
When I was doing my research, I figured how complex that problem is in terms of Kukis, Metis, Nagas. Everyone is kind of fighting for rights as well as territory. That's the sense I got. Again, this is a very generalized statement. It's an extremely complex history and it's an extremely complex issue in the modern day. So after seeing all these videos on YouTube, after doing my reading-based research, my consensus was that, is this even a solvable problem? Because if you negotiate with one group, then the other group might get pissed off.
Then everything's solvable. You must have heard recently, Ulfa also, faction came on board. Manipur mein UNLF faction came on board, which was functioning out of Myanmar. So every day you see, insurgent groups laying their arms. They are also tired, Ranveer. They're staying away from their families. They're in some rough terrain somewhere. They don't have proper food to eat, or, they have to live a rough life. This sort of negative environment, you can't sustain it.
Again, another thing I found pretty crazy as someone sitting in Mumbai is the fact that at one point, I think the local police in Manipur started fighting with the Indian army. They fired bullets at each other.
See, a lot of things have happened in Manipur. There's a lot of trust deficit between organizations, groups, communities. Sadly, I feel trust deficit, when that comes in, that's a little difficult to bridge. It takes time. It takes a lot of faith from both sides. You and me, both of us will want to solve a problem. Only then will it be solved. But sometimes there are vested interests. For them, it's beneficial to keep the problem running. And this is what we are seeing happening in Manipur.
What's happening as we speak?
So, see, obviously the conflict has become prolonged. Now, one of the reasons it has become prolonged is because these are two communities that have lived side by side for, ages. And there's no way they can go. This is where they have to live. Unfortunately, what has happened is communities have become confined to certain geographical areas.
Okay. In the valley, you'll mostly find the Metis and the hills have the Kukis.
And people say the valley is 10%. I'd say it's about 6%.
In terms of area?
Area. Because if you take out the lakes, the infrastructure, jo livable, habitable area hai, that is, in my opinion, about 6-7%. But that has the majority of the population. The hills has the minority population, and it's the hills. It has lesser development. And that's where largely the Kukis live. But, it's not just that the Kukis live there. You have the Metis also, you have the Nagas also. See, when we talk about Manipur, a lot of people only look at it from the prism of Kukis versus Metis. What about the Nagas? They're also there.
How do they feel about this conflict?
See, they have, obviously, there's been a Kuki-Naga in the 90s conflict as well, which took almost, I think, 6 years, Ranveer, if I'm not wrong, to subside. So they are, they have used better judgment, let's say, to not really push themselves in, because we don't need now another factor coming in and, this thing. But I think they would make a neutral party to be able to negotiate between two communities. This is my opinion, and tribal communities work very much on leadership, community leadership, elders who guide them. And I am not ready to believe that there aren't people like that. Who represent their own communities, who are willing to come on the table and say, okay, now what's the best that we can do?
Sure. Okay, coming back to what you said about vested interests. So the Cookies are traditionally a tribal community as well.
Yeah. Now, there's
Go on.
another thing in this, that Kuki is an umbrella term. Naga is an umbrella term. Tribes have sub-tribes also. So the Nagas were 16 plus sub-tribes. Naga is not one unified tribe.
Sure.
They had different languages, they had different clothes, different weaves. Weaves are very important. It tells you by looking at you which tribe you're from.
Gotcha.
And every home has a handloom sort of a machine, because they make their own weaves. And so they had that, was different, language was different. It was only when the British came in for better administration, let's say, like they did with the caste system, things like that, they changed the systems themselves. With the tribal systems also, what they said, we can't control them. They keep raiding us. We can't communicate with them. They won't listen to us. Let's give them morality. Let's give them civilization, because they saw tribal communities as uncivilized. So they gave them a common language. Then they gave them a common religion. So today, Nagaland is 95% Christian. It wasn't that before independence. So under these parameters, the Naga word came to be used as a
Umbrella term.
For
a lot of the tribes which had some similarities.
All tribes. All Naga tribes that had some loose connection, but they didn't even speak the same language. They gave them a language.
Sure.
So they started speaking the same common language. Then they gave them education. So they started speaking English. Then they gave them religion. So they all became Christians. So it became a unified umbrella. Same with the Cookies. Cookie is not one tribe per se. It'll have many sub-tribes under it. Cookie, we call them Cookies this side. The Mizos from Mizoram are also loosely connected to them. The Chins in Myanmar are also connected to them. So they have loose linguistic sort of relationships, ethnic relationships, not necessarily tight-knitted. Aisa nahi hai that everybody is a best friend.
Not every Cookie is.
Not every sub-tribe is a best friend of each other. Some sub-tribes feel, population-wise, that one is a bigger tribe. So hame dominate karta hai, hamara aspiration, they forget, So there is that kind of little inter-tribal rivalry, but the larger umbrella term is Cookie.
Gotcha. Okay. Back to the 2024 angle. So what's happening right now? Is this situation going to be solved anytime soon?
See, to keep the conflict like Manipur alive, you have to ask yourself, where's the ammunition coming from for so long?
Okay. Gotcha.
Where are the weapons coming from? Where's the money coming from?
So the vested interests lie in Myanmar.
Yes, there are transnational ethnic loyalties there also, right? In Myanmar. Because I said, it's one tribe, loosely connected, there's that, so sometimes...
Just sorry, I got to interrupt you for better understanding. What I understood from the research was that the Cookies in the 1800s or 1700s
were brought by the British.
From Myanmar.
See, again, boundary तो बीच में बना दिया ना. तो आधे सब ट्राइब्स उस साइड रह गए, आधे इस साइड रह गए. मगर अगर आप ये कहोगे ना, कुकी कहेगा नहीं हम तो यहाँ पहले से थे. That's where the history difference happens.
As in, Cookies believe that they were originally a part of...
the British didn't bring us. We've always been... Meiteis say, no, you were brought. Now we can debate this or whatever, but it might be better not to go into that territory.
Got it. No, I mean, for anyone from Manipur watching this, I'm just trying to learn here. Coming back to the vested interests angle. So people from Myanmar who are refugees, as well as possibly insurgents who are moving from Myanmar into India. You're saying that this fuels the fire that's going on in Manipur.
Yeah, of course, this fuels the fire. There are vested interests within Manipur also who would like to keep this running.
They like to keep this running in order to make more money?
More money? Conflict always makes money.
How does this conflict realistically make anyone money?
See, to keep a conflict running, you need to have some sort of trade going on. Whether it's buying weapons, whether it's selling weapons, whether it's drugs, whether it's the idea of an ambition of a greater independence. Just like we earlier spoke about Greater Nagaland. They wanted a separate country. Why do you want a separate country? Because you have greater authority. So why do you want territorial change in Manipur? Because you have greater authority. So this is also a power struggle, so as to say.
I also believe that some of that hilly land border that we share with Myanmar, or a lot of it, is very conducive to growing opium.
See, Myanmar, ever since Taliban has come into Afghanistan, a lot of the opium cultivation has shifted to Myanmar. So it's almost like 90% of their cultivation lands in the northeast, to the extent that Manipur at one point had the highest rate of HIV in the country because of intravenous drug use. Now that has been shifted to Mizoram. Now
One
Mizoram
second.
has
So
it.
whatever opium is growing in Myanmar is being sold in India,
Yeah,
and that's creating a drug problem
that's creating a drug problem, health problem.
that fuels the insurgency that's happening in Myanmar.
Correct, because they're making money, na? So they don't want these
Right.
borders to be blocked.
Okay. But do drugs get cultivated in India as well in the Northeast? Because I'm assuming the geography is similar.
See, I've been to these areas and it's you can't deny it. You can see complete hills that are shaved for poppy cultivation.
Gotcha.
And then apparently a lot of the treatment plants are back in Myanmar. So then it's further treated into other drugs. So it's not just heroin that is being used. There are all sorts of other levels of drugs that are being used and produced.
Okay. So the vested interests are all these things in terms of if there's a conflict, weapon trade makes X person money, drug trade makes X or Y person money, etc. There's a lot of money to be generated
There's a
from
lot of
conflict.
money, there's a lot of power. Like I see even people on social media raging and ranting about this from both sides.
You're talking about pro-Modi, anti-Modi.
No, I'm talking about pro-cookie, pro-Meti.
Oh, okay.
So I see people raging and ranting about it, putting up videos that obviously are real videos. I'm not denying, that they're not real and they're very sad. How is it helping the cause? What is it subsiding? It's almost like antagonizing you even more, because one community sees what's happening with somebody else and then they get upset. So I think there is no moderation in this. There is no moderate voice that's coming up and saying, guys, let's calm down. Let's take a breather. Let's put our weapons down. Let's not support anybody with weapons. You see, support can only also come on local grounds.
As in?
Like, if you're smuggling weapons in, where will you bring them from? You'll bring them across the border. Where will the insurgent hide? Where will he stay? Local support, if he does not have, then where's he going to keep all of this? How's he going to find his way through? So a lot of times there's local support also, because those guys also must get a pound of flesh, or they might feel some loyalty or something like that.
Fair. Coming back to the Manipur issue, I think your overarching point here is that someone from Manipur needs to come out and talk about a truce as well as address the issues on both sides and then come to a conclusion.
Yeah, I think, when there's trust deficit, when there has been stuff that's happened that's wrong on both ends, not just, it's not just the fault of one community, there are problems with both, then you have to build that trust. Before you start asking for what you are asking for, you need to start build that trust. You need to begin dialogue. You need to at least be able to sit on the table.
I want to have a slightly political discussion as well, keeping this Manipur angle in mind. I remember I was in Udaipur, I was on a break and I met someone from Manipur, and this was probably a week after that video about that girl had come out. And I had a long conversation with him.
Sorry, which girl?
The cookie girl who was paraded. And I just asked him, what's happening according to you? Because you've grown up in Manipur. What he told me is that it's very layered and there's vested interests. The people are suffering. And I also remember long ago when I'd spoken to someone else about Imphal, they had drawn out a very beautiful picture of it. In terms of it's a very peaceful land, people are very nice, etc.
Yeah.
So the combination of these two conversations just broke my heart a little bit. The political conversation I want to have here is, say if you are the central government right now and you know that there's this issue happening in Manipur, obviously your intention is to solve it. The solution, perhaps, that the Home Minister is discussing is that we send in a section of the military at least to help calm down the situation. Now, practically, what's going to happen is that that section of the military is going to go there. They would like for the tension to come down just because of their presence, perhaps because the leaders on both sides realize, okay, the Indian military is here now. We can't go about battling with each other. I think that's the intention. Now, does that really happen or not? Keeping in mind that even the local police force has both Meitei and Kuki people. I believe even the local police force was split.
See, there is trust deficit with the forces. There'll be one section who'll say, oh, you're favoring that community. There'll be another section that'll say you're favoring that community. I don't think that's true. I think this is, again, there's a lot of propaganda. Ranveer, you're a social media sensation, so as to say, you know this better than anybody else. How quickly can you change perceptions through propaganda on social media? I mean, you run one video over and over again and use one incident to completely blacklist a whole community. The same way you use one video of a soldier and completely blacklist, the regiment he comes from, let's say. It's not fair. I was very sad, when this incident that you're speaking about, because for me, nothing can be worse than using women and children as political fodder or, as human shields to get what you want. And it doesn't matter whether it's Kuki, it's Meitei, it's Naga. It should never happen with a woman. That's not how you get what you want. I think that's a very cowardly thing to do. After that, do you remember those 2 children who were kidnapped? Just as peace started coming back into the valley, photographs of their dead bodies were released. The first thing that told me is somebody doesn't want
this conflict to calm down.
Yeah. So I think whenever we say something about this conflict, or whenever we try to analyze it, assess it, and all of us have the right to do that, we have to do it with a very, very balanced mind.
Because we've not been born and raised in Manipur, first and foremost.
First and foremost.
You don't even know what's up. Like the news media will always show you
the worst of the worst.
Yeah.
How many times, tell me, in our news channels before Manipur conflict, did we hear about the good things that were happening there? How many times did it make front page news? How many times did it get the kind of, just the attention that it's getting even on social media? Nobody spoke about it. Agar 74% reduction in insurgency hua hai, everybody should have known this number on their fingertips.
What's a day in Imphal like now?
See, there is a bifurcation. The valley is bifurcated from the hills. I had the opportunity, and it was a very delicate process where I could go to both areas, and I met, in both areas, I met the refugee camps. So,
what do you mean in both areas you met the refugee?
Valley. Valley mein, people who were from the hill areas, the Meiteis, their homes were burnt and they had to come to the valley.
Oh, okay.
From the valley and other places, some of the Kukis had to go
Got it.
to other places. So there are temporary refugee camps. I also had the opportunity to meet some of the village defense force who had guns and who were perched on hills, just protecting their villages. But it was incredible. They would sit there for 9 days, each person, and then a rotation would happen. So 3-4 people would sit together. 9 days, the rotation would happen. 9 days, mosquito infested. Just in, how you see in the movies, like, how you see in the Vietnam War movies, you have those bamboo sticks sort of, little on a little height perched up, and, you have people sitting there. It's similar like that, that's the best example I can give. Though I think I have a couple of photos on my social media of that. That's where they sit. And 9 days. And some of them are not very old also, And I felt very bad, because what is their future? Once you get used to this life, it's very difficult to...
How long has it been?
That they've been doing this?
Yes.
Throughout the conflict, they've been protecting their...
Which is how long?
Which is since May, when it really broke out, May 3rd. May 3rd is the date when it blew up.
What happened on May 3rd?
Now, there are many, many small instances. It started 6 months ago, there were little triggers and there were little conflicts. And then the Meiteis have been asking for scheduled tribe status. Scheduled tribe status means that if you have that, you have access to scheduled tribe land. It also has other benefits like income tax exemption, reservations, so on and so forth. The Meiteis feel that they are confined to the valley, and the Cookies feel that the Meiteis dominate the power center. The High Court passed a ruling saying that, this was, I think, in April, passed a ruling saying that, look, they should be considered. To get scheduled tribe status, Ranveer, is a very long process. State recommend karta hai, then it goes to National Commission of Scheduled Tribes, then it goes to RGI, then it goes to TRI, then it goes, to the cabinet, and then it can be contested also. But the High Court happened to give the suggestion to the state government that recommend Meiteis for scheduled tribe status. There was a rally being taken out, a peaceful rally, and then conflict broke out between the two communities, and it seemed like one community was opposing the other community's scheduled tribe inclusion. However, Cookies are under the scheduled tribe. This did not include the Nagas, who are also scheduled tribes. So it was just between the Cookies and the Meiteis. The Nagas didn't get involved. So that makes me question. But these are complicated issues, and that's long back. What I think now that is happening really is that we have a difficult situation on our hands with Myanmar imploding. Anything that happens on our border states, instability, is obviously going to affect us, and it's going to affect us in terms of not just illegal migration, refugees, a lot of problems for our resources and our security, but also in terms of this sort of illegal cultivation. There was also, and these were not rumors, but this was actually, there's evidence for it, that a lot of the illegal immigrants from Myanmar were growing poppy on our land. And the Myanmarese government actually took out a notification saying that any Myanmarese citizen in Manipur, should refrain from any illegal activity and causing any ethnic conflict and problems.
So the conflict, as long as it's on, will create money. And then money then possibly fuels the conflict in Myanmar.
Yeah, it also pushes some people who have a larger agenda, in terms of humko territorial independence mil jayega. We are different from you.
Do they truly feel this? Or is it an attempt again to keep the conflict running?
I'll tell you, if you were to go and ask a young person, and I'm not talking about one of those young people who's got carried away by social media and is hating and raging. I'm not talking about them. If you were to go and talk to a rational person and privately, they tell you we don't want this. They tell you, we don't know how to end this, but we can see that it's a detriment of. In the last 6 years, Manipur had made great progress. We can see this is a detriment to all of that.
Again, the overarching conversation here is that the conflict is being kept alive, likely by some old men sitting in Myanmar who are making money off the conflict.
I love to say they're old men.
I mean, any conflict is
bad old men and who are going to go away really soon. No.
Any conflict in the world.
A lot of these are young people in Myanmar. See, Myanmar has had a history of instability. And it's got multiple ethnic groups. All these ethnic groups have had their own aspirations.
Again, this seems to be the root of the problem that's happening in Manipur. So if you want to kind of solve the conflict in Manipur, make the leaders from the two communities sit at the same table and come to a conclusion, as well as kind of secure that border that at least Manipur shares with Myanmar, or secure the whole border that India shares with Myanmar.
100%. You have to secure the border. I don't know how the whole border will be secured, but
drones.
drones is a great idea. They have all of that. They're going to do facial recognition. That FMR, free movement regime, there used to be between Myanmar and India, where 16 kilometers you could come in this way or that way, because these are transnational ethnic ties, right? So there's local trade that happens and things like that. That also they've stopped, or they are stopping now, because there was no way of telling if those people were going back. So all these actions are being taken, no doubt about that. But here are the problems, and let me pose this to you. There are two groups. Let's say there isn't one cohesive voice from each group. Who do you negotiate with?
First, make them elect the leaders.
Tell them to come together as a group and maybe nominate, right? Then look at the realistic problems. Like the cookies, honestly, this is a problem, and I have again voiced this also, that hill areas are less developed. If development is a problem, let's solve that problem. How do we ensure that development's better? Why has development not happened? And what are the areas that you need development in?
Is this a religious conflict?
No.
No.
It's not a religious conflict. The Western world loves to make it a religious conflict. Anything to do with India becomes a religious conflict, And then you have vested interests who try to manipulate that as well, because then it gives meat to the matter. People want to pick it up. And unfortunately, with this dispensation, what has happened is that there are so many international agencies that, without understanding the issue, have labeled it religious.
What about the cookies?
The cookies are all Christians.
This is why it's probably painted as a religious.
This is why it's painted as a religious thing. But, they didn't fight because of a church or a temple. They fought because they felt scared about, their land being less or their development not happening.
The core of the problem is not religious.
But it's not just those buildings, na? Houses have also been burnt. Institutions have also been burnt. So why are we focusing on the temples and the...
I think it's being focused on by the media for what you said, for geopolitical reasons.
Media seems to love religion all of a sudden, and the dividing factors of religion. It doesn't want to go deeper into it and say, well, this was only a subset of it. If these buildings were burnt, other buildings were burnt also.
Media loves TRPs. TRPs increase when news links are shared. News links are shared when they contain hatred.
Absolutely.
And the easiest way to spread hatred is to spread religious tension. That's
really well put. I would not be able to put it better than you put it.
The average kid in Mumbai, Delhi, Bangalore doesn't understand the depths of the issue that's happening in Manipur. And that's why easily brackets it as a religious / BJP related issue.
But you see, we don't even understand our own civilizational continuity. In terms of religious issues, so we don't understand what is happening in Manipur. But even in the rest of the country, we don't understand, how we are different from other countries. The same context cannot be applied to the Indian context, and this whole civilizational, I know is now a popularly, used phrase, civilizational lens, but it is a lens problem. I'll tell you what is the definition of tribes. If this fight is on somebody wanting a scheduled tribe status and somebody not wanting them to have it, there was a local committee which sat down to decide who is a tribe. Because हमारे civilization में तो there was no separate thing as a tribe. So, the British brought it in the first census. So anyway, later the local committee said, it should be geographical isolation. It should be unique traditions, backwardness, things like that. Most tribes don't fit into that criteria any longer. So these are contexts that we have to understand before we make a judgment.
Sure.
And it's not easy.
This conversation is just an attempt at better understanding. There's no way that you and me together or individually could come up with a solution for this, because...
Oh, yeah. I think the only people who can come up with a solution for this is them.
The locals.
The locals.
The Methi leaders and the Kuki leaders.
And they're very capable of coming up with solutions. See, there have been conflicts, ethnic conflicts before. This is not the first time. There's been a Kuki Paiti. Paiti is a subtribe of the Kuki. There's been a Kuki Paiti conflict. There's been a Kuki Naga conflict. So there have been multiple conflicts like this, and they've all been resolved over a period of time.
Okay.
So why do we feel that this will not be resolved?
What role should the central government be playing here?
See, the central government should be playing the role of a mediator, which it is. I know this for a fact. That a lot of the leadership from the communities are in Delhi, they're in negotiations, they're speaking. But you see, tempers have to calm down before you can come to a solution. If you're raging and I try to give you rational thought, you might not want to take it at that point. You might not be very receptive to it, right? So I think tempers need to calm down. I think people need to stop spreading, contentious like material.
On social media.
I think that, I know it's very hurtful. If somebody from my neighborhood, somebody from your neighborhood was hurt, unfairly so, one would feel bad and one would not want to get on the negotiating table. But for the larger common good, you will have to today or tomorrow. No conflict runs forever.
Okay, let's have a slightly positive spin on the same conversation. Could you suggest some tourism-based experiences for people from outside the Northeast? Because I love talking about this India tourism thing. I've also heard from all my friends who've actually explored the Northeast that it's probably the most beautiful part of India, but the rest of India doesn't know about it. In some ways, that's also good.
That's also very good, huh?
But could you suggest 4 or 5 incredible travel experiences?
I think, again, it depends state-wise. So everybody should go to the Hornbill Festival, maybe as an initiation to what Naga culture is, right? Everybody should go to Manipur. Things are not very good right now, but the only way we can get it back on track is also to start normalizing it, right? Manipur has great hills, it has great lakes, it's a beautiful city, it has great cuisine. It's also one of the places which has great syncretic culture. So, the original indigenous culture, the Sanamahism has kind of come together seamlessly with Vaishnavism. So it's created this larger hybrid culture. So it's great fun to watch. They have Ras Leela, they have things like that. Tripura, you have one of the Shakti Peeths there, called Tripura Sundari. You also have great archaeological sites. Of course, then the national parks, Kaziranga, must go. Arunachal Pradesh. I'm sure a lot of people who like to hike, who like to trek, would like to go there. The tea plantations across, great places to go and spend quiet days. And, if somebody's a writer, to go to a tea plantation. And you'd almost feel like you've been shifted to a different era. Try the food out. It's amazing. It changes from state to state to state. And people say that there isn't vegetarian food. There's a huge vegetarian cuisine also in these areas. So there's multiple things to do. People who like horticulture, again, amazing places to go to, because in some of these hilly areas, you'll have orchids and lotuses and all sorts of different sorts of horticultural sort of experiences that you can have. Camping, not just in Kaziranga and all, but even in the hill areas in Nagaland, in Manipur. People used to go camping overnight because there used to be overnight concerts. Like I said, music is a huge part of their lives. I would also suggest to go to some of the archaeological sites, Umakoti in Tripura. People don't know much about it. Very interesting. I would also, once things become more peaceful in Manipur, say Moreh is in the border between Myanmar and Manipur. I would say use that route and go into Myanmar as well.
It's like a very urban Indian thought to chalk out 1 week from your life every 6 months at least and pick out a place in India. So if they have 1 week's time and they want to definitely go to Guwahati, but they also want to see another state, you'd suggest Meghalaya?
I'd suggest Meghalaya. There's a short train to Dimapur in Nagaland. And from there you can go to Kohima, which is, more hilly or whatever.
Gotcha.
The thing about Northeast, at least in my opinion, is be a little experiential.
Just go there and see what.
Just go there, see where it takes you, figure out while you're there what interests you. Some people don't like certain cities because they feel it's like back home. Like, we've been to Nainital, Vaisa, or we've been here, Vaisa. So you have to see what you like because it has so much to offer. The hills are great, the forests are great, the lakes are great, the pilgrimage tourism is exceptional, and we haven't really explored it enough,
What is Nagaland like?
Stunning. The food's incredible. It's a haven for non-vegetarian people, because the cuisine is largely non-vegetarian. Very good-looking people, So let me say this: the Northeasterners are by far one of the most good-looking bunch of people I've seen. Aesthetically beyond. Again in Nagaland also I've seen a lot of young women going back to their traditional craft of bamboo making. So you see the furniture there, you see the clothes there. You think this is coming from somewhere else. It's incredible how aesthetically attuned that they are to being able to use natural products into making things that would like appeal to the rest of the world.
Okay. Again, lots of data. So I'm going to go back to my basic questions. Why was the Northeast ignored for so long?
Now, there are two reasons for it. Number one, the way geographically the Northeast has been mapped out. If you look at the map, you have the mainland here, and then you have a 22-kilometer road that connects the Siliguri corridor or the Chicken's Neck that we call it, that connects it to the Northeast. 22 kilometers. Who thought of it? Because it connects our most important region to the rest of the country. It can be, if there are bad intentions, it can be cut off at any given point of time. How long is a 22-kilometer width road going to take? What that also does is makes your accessibility less, right? Train lines, flights, or even road travel, having good roads. But the other problem is that we had a policy of isolation and exclusion. Till this dispensation came in, the idea was right from post-independence that, keep this separate, keep it less developed. Because if it's less developed, we'll have less threat from China. This made no sense whatsoever. That don't build roads. Let complete authority be with local leaders, as it should be. But eventually, this is a nation. We need that kind of interaction. We need that kind of engagement with the central government. But here they become like little fiefdoms, the governments. It was dynastic politics in the Northeast as well. And that in the changing global scenario doesn't really work out. But let me go one step further. The dispensations post-independence were following colonial policies. So we didn't even change the policies that the British applied on the Northeast after we gained independence.
Were these policies of the British also kind of separating the Northeast from the rest of the country?
It actually was, and it is shocking, Ranveer.
Is it because of this whole divide and rule angle again?
Yes,
Okay.
and it's shocking because the British came into the Northeast much later, because again, it was very far away and this and that. So after they won the Battle of Plassey, I think it was in Bengal, I think 1757, that's when they really set their eyes on the Northeast. And as usual, kingdoms there were having internal conflicts. The Burmese were invading India very often on the Northeastern, so we had the First Anglo-Burmese War, we had the Second Anglo-Burmese War. I think the first one was 1824 to 1826, and so on and so forth. We had three Anglo-Burmese War. Now, they asked the British to come and defend them.
The kingdoms at the border.
Yeah, like the Assamese, the Manipuris, So once they did that, obviously they'd cemented their hold. They managed to put their favored person on the throne. And the British were always very astute businessmen. So they had already known about China being at the frontier, Myanmar being there. There was a big trade war to do with tea that was going on. So tea was being manufactured in China, but the British also wanted a stake. This was also the time, Ranveer, when they were wanting to colonize and wanting to trade. Now, it needed shipbuilding. Shipbuilding needed timber. Myanmar, Northeast was full of it. These were great, like very rich grounds for them. Also, they realized that it has minerals. These are rich areas. So, these were many of the reasons that they got very excited about the Northeast. However, the Northeastern populations are hugely territorial. Territorial integrity is hugely important to them. They're also extremely, Ranveer, they have a lot of pride. Tribal communities, and it's largely tribal communities. Tribal communities are very attached to their land. They're very attached to their own administrative systems.
Rules.
Yeah, means there are rules that all old civilizations come up, which is best suited to them. Suddenly the British come and they apply rules, they weren't going to take it lightly. So there were many uprisings against them, this, that. The British realized a lot of the tribes, including the Naga tribes, they couldn't control. Now, every time they would try to move on their trade routes in the Northeast, these guys would come raiding. There were some massacres, there was raids, and they'd, finish off their contingent and go back. They couldn't do anything because they weren't being able to handle them. So they created what was called the inner line regulation, which we still have. Inner line regulation meant that they could not come out of a certain boundary area that they'd pulled. Then there was the excluded, included areas. These were excluded areas. So they wouldn't have the same development that the rest of the country had. So there was like this policy of non-interference with them. The Congress, International Congress in 1936, Ranveer said, this is really bad. You can't divide our communities like this, because if they don't get the same development that the rest of the country will, at some point they will, they'll resent it and they will not have the same opportunities that we do. We have to find a way to integrate them. And obviously that wasn't in the favor of the British. So they kept these policies. So inner line permit meant that, for example, the Nagas could not come out of that line that was drawn. And, people like you and me from the rest of the country could not go in. However, there was also another angle to this. They said we have to tame them. See, the idea of tribal is very alien to us. For the British, it was wild populations. They needed to be tamed, So then they brought in religion as well. So Nagaland, as a matter of fact, missionaries could go in, but sadhus couldn't. So these were many, many reasons why policy-wise, these areas became divided.
So a lot of the modern day Northeast issues actually began with the British.
Exactly.
They were kind of also at the receiving end of lack of policy making by the governments right after independence, which is the Nehru
Absolutely.
government.
Absolutely. So first, it was the British. They were all self-ruling and there were kingdoms and they had their own ways of interacting with each other. Sub-tribes were very independent. They would pay tax to, let's say, the king of Assam and, so on and so forth. But they had their own way of figuring things out. The British come in, they bring in these new policies, right? They also interfered a lot with their social structures. So creating either umbrella identities or fragmented identities. या तो identity जो थी उसको तोड़ दिया, या तो एक ऐसा umbrella identity बना दिया that suddenly there were groups who felt like, oh, We are one and we're on the side of the British, And like you said, unfortunately, post-independence, we didn't relook at this because Nehru's tribal affairs advisor was a missionary called Verrier Elwin, who was a white man. So again, this is about perspectives. My perspective will not be the same as somebody who's born, brought up in the West, and their perspective may not be the same as mine.
Sure. But you said that they didn't want to develop the Northeast because it would attract attention from China.
This was post-independence.
What's the logic behind this?
That if there isn't infrastructure, there's no logic behind it. A lot of things are completely illogical. But if there's no roads, there's no sort of way of getting in. There isn't any industry. उनको क्या ही मिलेगा वहाँ?
It won't be attractive enough for
It
China?
won't be attractive enough. It's a very flimsy policy mistake. But I'll tell you something. The fact is that nobody wanted to have a focus on the Northeast. It was too far out. Everybody was too focused on Jammu and Kashmir. Our Western frontier has taken up our entire, imagination. One of the reasons that has happened is, there's Western interest in that Western frontier as well. But the Northeastern frontier is just like, for example, the border with India and Myanmar is 1,643 kilometers of porous border. We have borders with Bangladesh, we have sea borders. It's a huge, massive border. Attention should be there. Jammu, Kashmir to sambhal liya hai, and even earlier on, there was a lot of focus, a lot of academic interest, scholarship, military interest, international vested interest. Who's ever heard of the Northeast frontier? Anybody being interested in? They used to call whatever happened that side, they used to call it the Great Game West. Now they're calling this area the Great Game East.
Yeah. Also, I've only been to Guwahati, but I've been there in the winter where the sun sets at 4 p.m.
Yeah.
And I know that there's an argument that a lot of people from the Northeast make that they need a separate time zone. And I'm fully in favor of that argument because I feel it does affect productivity.
Yeah.
Now, the thing is, this is a very everyday life anecdote. So I can't imagine what else people of the Northeast, generally speaking, are going through. And I understand why they would feel ignored. All we can do as media professionals is take steps in the right direction and talk about the Northeast more, at least. Because I promise you, and I hate saying this to everyone watching this from the Northeast, but the rest of India doesn't know much about you. Because the media has not spoken about you guys enough. And I think this is a step in the right direction. So irrespective of who's talking about it, at least we're moving, towards
Absolutely.
learning.
And that should be appreciated. And I'll tell you, it's a two-way thing. If we didn't speak a lot about them, and if there was this sort of, I'd even go as far as to say there used to be this underlying discrimination, right? Even when I went there, their names were outsiders from them also, because there was a distance that was created.
There is racism in the Indian metros towards people from the Northeast.
There's racism, and again, that's a new civilizational lens that has come about because Indian civilization didn't have an idea about race. If it did, for example, if we had any idea about race in our history, Rukmini is slated to be from Arunachal Pradesh, right? There's an entire, one of the bigger tribes consider themselves descendants of Rukmini and say that, Krishna Bhagwan came to get her there. Chitrangada is supposed to be from Manipur. Hidimba and Ghatotkacha's kingdom is supposed to be Dimapur in Nagaland. So what does that tell us? That race was not a part of our mental makeup. This has come later somewhere, just the way diversity was not alien to us. But today, when we talk about it, it's like, we need to, there's a uniqueness, which needs to be preserved. Of course, all uniqueness needs to be preserved. Everybody, I'm Gujarati, and I'm from a certain part of Gujarat. It has different cultural, ways of doing things, then maybe another side of Gujarat, So everybody wants to preserve their cultural identity, but that doesn't mean you're separate from anyone else.
Okay. The one thing I've realized at this point in our conversation is that there's no end to this conversation, firstly, about everything that's happening in Manipur.
Yeah.
And everything that's happening developmentally in the Northeast in general. This is a very, very long, deep conversation. There's a limit to how much information you can impart through a podcast episode. And this whole episode was just an attempt to learn more about what's happening in Manipur. Not learn all of it, but just learn more. I'm 100% sure that there might be people with like opposing viewpoints. There might be people with some other opinion of what the truth is also.
Of course.
So there's going to be people who are going to get pissed off by the end of this episode. My only response is that suggest guests. Who else would you like to see speak about this topic? I'm happy to bring on anyone, honestly, who can add value to the audiences. You've added value to our life. Rami Desai, thank you for being with us today.
Not at all. It was great to be here.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
Learned a lot speaking to you. Thank you. That was the episode for today, ladies and gentlemen. I sincerely hope that this episode reaches many families in Manipur. I sincerely hope that the situation gets more attention from the Indian government. I sincerely hope that this podcast has helped the situation in some way. I wish to bring on many more guests who are able to speak about the Northeast in much more detail. TRS is here to create a change and to help the future of our country as a whole. Keep supporting, keep watching, keep learning, keep sending in your feedback, and keep helping us get better so that we can bring you better, deeper conversations regularly. Thank you so much.